Cold winds bit through Evelyn's thin jacket. Marcus threw her bags onto freezing gravel. "Get out," he sneered, slamming his heavy oak door shut. Snowflakes began falling, whispering promises of a brutal winter. She had $7 in her pocket, nothing more. No friends nearby, no shelter. Most people would panic freeze or beg for mercy. Evelyn did none of those things. Instead, she built a fortress, a bizarre curved shelter made from trash dirt and sheer willpower. What happened next baffled local authorities, shocked her cruel ex-husband, and uncovered a terrifying secret hiding inside perfectly dry firewood. The bitter chill of late October in Montana's Ravalli County is unforgiving. It doesn't announce itself with a gentle frost. It arrives like a slammed door, freezing the moisture in your lungs and hardening the earth into solid iron. Evelyn Vance knew this cold. She had lived in the Bitterroot Valley for 5 years, but she had always observed the changing of the seasons from behind the double-paned glass of a heated farmhouse. Now, standing on the desolate shoulder of County Road 9, the cold was no longer scenery. It was an executioner. Just an hour prior, Evelyn's life had shattered. Her relationship with Marcus Thorne had been a slow, suffocating descent into financial and emotional imprisonment. Marcus, a local contractor with a reputation for sharp elbows and a short temper, had systematically isolated her. He had convinced her to quit her job at the clinic, close their joint accounts, and put everything in his name. Everything that is, except a worthless, barren 2-acre plot of rocky scrubland 20 miles outside of town, which he had bought at a tax lien sale and mockingly deeded to her as a birthday gift the year prior. Their final argument had been over a simple receipt. Evelyn had found documentation proving Marcus was moving large sums of money into an offshore account, preparing to declare bankruptcy on his contracting business while keeping his personal wealth intact. When she confronted him, his reaction was swift, ruthless, and terrifyingly calm. He didn't hit her. He did something worse. He packed a single duffel bag with her oldest clothes, grabbed her by the arm, and shoved her into his heavy-duty diesel truck. He drove in silence as the sky bruised into a deep, stormy purple. When they reached her barren 2-acre plot, a place devoid of trees, water, or shelter, he slammed the brakes. "This is yours," Marcus had said, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "You wanted independence. You wanted to look into my finances. Now you can manage your own." He tossed her bag out the window. "Don't bother walking back to town. By the time you make it, the blizzard will have hit. Call someone if you want, but we both know your phone was cut off yesterday." With the crunch of heavy tires on frozen gravel, Marcus drove away, the red taillights of his truck disappearing around the bend, leaving Evelyn entirely alone as the first sharp flakes of snow began to fall. Evelyn stood paralyzed for a long time. The silence of the remote valley was deafening, broken only by the whistling wind cutting through the sparse sagebrush. Panic, thick and suffocating, clawed at her throat. She sank to her knees, her hands digging into the freezing dirt. She had no car, no phone service, and no family within 1,000 miles. Her parents had passed away years ago, and her friends in town were mostly Marcus's friends, people who would look the other way if it meant staying in his good graces. She forced herself to breathe, inhale the ice, exhale the fear. She unzipped the duffel bag Marcus had thrown into the dirt. Inside were a few pairs of jeans, some wool socks, 2 worn flannel shirts, a heavy utility jacket, a single plastic tarp she had used for gardening, a basic utility knife, a disposable lighter, and her wallet. She opened the wallet. Her credit cards were gone. Marcus had seen to that. All that remained was a single crumpled $5 bill and 2 silver dollar coins. $7. $7 to her name in a winter storm, bearing down that the local radio had warned would drop temperatures into the single digits by nightfall. Evelyn stood up, her jaw set. Despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. If she tried to walk the 20 miles to town in the dark, she would die of exposure. The wind chill was already plummeting. She needed shelter, and she needed it immediately. Looking around the barren property, she spotted a dark outline in the distance just off the edge of her property line. It was an old illegal dumping ground, tucked behind a rocky outcropping. Locals had been throwing farm debris there for decades. Most people saw an eyesore. In that moment, Evelyn Vance saw a hardware store. She zipped her jacket tight, shoved her $7 deep into her pocket, and began to walk toward the rusted metal and broken plastic, her mind racing with a desperate, frantic blueprint for survival. The scrap heap was a twisted graveyard of agricultural failures. Rusted barbed wire rotting fence posts, shattered fiberglass troughs, and piles of unidentifiable industrial plastic lay half buried in the frozen weeds. Evelyn moved through the dangerous debris with frantic purpose, her utility knife in hand. The wind was picking up, howling through the canyons and driving sharp snow into her eyes. She had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. As she dug through a mound of dead blackberry brambles, her hand struck something hard and cold. She pulled away the vines to reveal a stack of discarded cattle panels, heavy-duty galvanized steel fencing made of thick welded wire grids. They were 16 feet long and about 50 inches wide. A little further down the heap, she found several lengths of flexible, thick-gauge PVC piping discarded from an old irrigation system. An idea sparked in her mind. A memory from her childhood in the Midwest, watching her grandfather construct temporary greenhouses. A Quonset hut. The semicircular structure was aerodynamically perfect for deflecting harsh winds and incredibly strong under heavy snow loads. She began dragging the heavy cattle panels back to her plot of land. It was grueling, agonizing work. The steel tore at her gloves and scraped her shins. Her breath came in ragged, misty gasps. By the time she had dragged 4 panels to a relatively flat, slightly sunken depression on her land, her muscles were screaming in protest. But she had a structural problem. Cattle panels are incredibly rigid. To bend them into a sturdy arch, she needed to stake them down securely and bind them together. She had no rope, no wire, and the ground was rapidly freezing too hard to drive wooden stakes deep enough to hold the immense tension of bent steel. She looked down the road. About 2 miles away, sitting at the junction of the highway, was an old rundown gas station and bait shop run by an elderly man named Donovan Hayes. It was a risky walk, burning precious daylight, but she had no choice. Evelyn ran a half-jog, half-limp against the biting wind. When she burst into the dimly lit store, the bell above the door jingled weakly. Donovan, a man with a face like weathered leather, looked up from behind the counter, startled by her disheveled, frantic appearance. "Evelyn, good Lord, girl, what are you doing out here? The radio says a whiteout is coming," Donovan said, setting down his coffee mug. "Donovan, I need heavy-duty zip ties. The thickest, strongest ones you have, industrial grade, and a roll of duct tape. Quick, please." She panted, her teeth beginning to chatter. Donovan frowned, moving toward an aisle. "Where's Marcus? Did your truck break down? Let me call someone." "No." Evelyn snapped, perhaps a little too harshly. She softened her tone. "No phones. Please, just the zip ties and tape." He handed her a thick canister of black UV-resistant HVAC zip ties, the kind used to secure heavy ductwork, and a battered roll of silver tape. "That's $12, Evelyn." Evelyn pulled out the crumpled 5 and the 2 silver dollars. She laid the $7 on the scratched glass counter. "This is all I have, Donovan. It's a matter of life and death, I swear to you." Donovan looked at the $7, then at Evelyn's desperate, terrified eyes. He slowly slid the money into his register. "Get home safe, girl." Evelyn grabbed the supplies and sprinted back into the gathering storm. The snow was falling thicker now, coating the ground in a treacherous, slippery white. Back at her plot, she worked like a woman possessed. She placed the ends of the cattle panels into the shallow trench she had kicked out of the dirt. Using all her body weight, she bent the thick steel mesh upward, forcing the opposite end into the other side of the trench, creating an arch about 6 feet high in the center. The steel groaned and fought against her, trying to snap back violently. With shaking hands, she looped the industrial zip ties around the overlapping edges of the panels, pulling them taut with every ounce of strength she had left. The ratcheting zip, zip, zip sound was the only thing cutting through the howl of the wind. She reinforced the arches with the flexible PVC pipes, taping them along the spine of the curve for added rigidity. Within an hour, she had a skeletal dome of steel and plastic, but it was completely open to the elements. She grabbed her single tarp and dragged it over the back half of the structure, zip-tying it down to block the prevailing north wind. Then she turned to the earth. building a debris hut over a frame was the oldest survival trick in the book. She began piling everything she could find: dead sagebrush tumbleweeds, loose topsoil pine needles dragged from the edge of the property, and chunks of broken sod. She piled it a foot thick over the entire structure, leaving only a small crawlspace entrance and a tiny ventilation hole at the top. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Evelyn crawled into the dark, earthy-smelling tunnel of her makeshift Quonset hut. She dragged her duffel bag across the entrance to block the wind. Inside, the silence was absolute. The thick layer of earth and debris completely muffled the raging blizzard outside. The ambient heat from her own body, trapped within the small insulated dome, slowly raised the temperature just above freezing. She wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she owned, curling into a tight ball on the dirt floor. She had survived the night. She had built a home for $7. But as the dawn broke, casting a pale, freezing light through the tiny vent hole, Evelyn knew her real fight was just beginning. She couldn't survive the whole winter on body heat alone. She needed fire, and she needed a mountain of wood. Over the next 2 weeks, Evelyn's survival routine became a brutal mechanical process. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind 2 feet of snow and a permanent biting cold that refused to lift above 20 degrees. Her $7 Quonset hut held up miraculously well. The heavy snowpack actually served as an excellent additional layer of insulation over the debris shell. But the cold was a relentless predator, constantly pacing outside her mud walls. Evelyn spent 10 hours a day scavenging for firewood. Without an axe or a saw, she was forced to break dead branches by wedging them between rocks and stomping on them, or dragging massive rotting logs for miles across the snow. She built a small lean-to against the side of her hut to store the wood, painstakingly stacking the damp, snow-logged branches to dry out. She built a small fire ring just outside her entrance, using the coals to heat rocks, which she would then roll into her hut at night to act as thermal batteries. It was a primitive existence, but she was adapting. Her hands grew calloused, her face windburned, her body lean and hard. She was surviving, and in a small, fiercely proud corner of her heart, she was winning. Until Marcus Thorne found out. Marcus had expected Evelyn to come crawling back to him within 48 hours. He had waited in his warm, custom-built house, leaving his phone on loud, anticipating the desperate, tearful call, begging for forgiveness. When a week passed, he assumed she had hitched a ride out of state. But a passing rumor at Donovan's bait shop shattered his smug satisfaction. Donovan had casually mentioned to a local rancher that he hoped that Vance girl was holding up out on County Road 9. Furious, Marcus drove his truck out to the barren plot one bleak, overcast afternoon. He parked a mile down the road and hiked in his hunting binoculars slung around his neck. When he crested the ridge and looked down at the plot, his jaw dropped. There, sitting defiantly in the middle of the snowy wasteland, was a perfectly camouflaged, snow-covered dome. A thin, steady ribbon of gray smoke curled up from a stone fire pit near the entrance. A substantial pile of scavenged wood was neatly stacked under a tarp lean-to. She wasn't just surviving, she was proving him entirely unnecessary. She was making a mockery of his power over her. A dark, ugly rage boiled up in Marcus's chest. He couldn't let her win. If she wanted to play pioneer, he would show her just how harsh the frontier could be. He watched through his binoculars until he saw Evelyn emerge from the hut, dragging a bundle of branches, and begin walking toward the distant tree line to gather more. She would be gone for at least 2 hours. Marcus descended the ridge, moving quickly through the snow. He approached the Quonset hut, sneering at the primitive construction. He walked over to her painstakingly gathered woodpile. It represented hundreds of hours of backbreaking labor. With a vicious kick from his steel-toed boot, Marcus shattered the lean-to. The poles snapped and the tarp collapsed. He didn't stop there. He kicked the stacked wood, violently scattering the logs into the deep, wet snowdrifts. He stamped the smaller branches into the freezing mud beneath the snow, ensuring they would be soaked through and frozen solid within the hour. To finish the job, he kicked snow over the remaining fire pit, hissing as the hot coals died out in a cloud of dirty steam. "Let's see you survive now, you arrogant," he muttered, turning on his heel and marching back to his truck, feeling a sick sense of triumphant satisfaction. Evelyn returned an hour before dusk. The sky was already darkening, the temperature plummeting rapidly. When she saw the ruined lean-to, she dropped her bundle of branches. She fell to her knees in the snow, staring at the scattered frozen wood. The maliciousness of the act was unmistakable. Only one person hated her enough to do this: Marcus. Tears of sheer frustration and exhaustion spilled hot down her freezing cheeks. She grabbed a log, but it was already encased in a shell of ice from the wet snow. Wet wood wouldn't catch fire. Without a roaring fire tonight, she wouldn't be able to heat her rocks. Without the rocks, the temperature in the hut would drop below freezing. She could freeze to death in her sleep. "No," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking. "No, you don't get to kill me." She began frantically digging through the snow and mud, trying to find any pieces of wood that might have stayed dry beneath the scattered pile. Her bare hands scraped against ice and frozen dirt. She dug deeper into the ground, where the center of her woodpile had been, hoping to find some dry kindling she had buried. Her frozen fingers struck something hard. It wasn't a rock. It didn't have the rough, jagged feel of Montana granite. It was smooth, wood, but not scavenged wood. It felt like a plank. Evelyn brushed the snow and mud away rapidly, her heart pounding. Beneath a thin layer of topsoil that Marcus's heavy boots had disturbed, there were heavy treated wooden boards laid flat against the earth. It looked like a trap door. Adrenaline surging, she used her utility knife to pry at the edges of the boards. They were old, partially rotted on the surface, but heavy. With a massive heave, she ripped the boards back. A rush of dry, stale air hit her face. She peered into the darkness of the hole. It was an old, forgotten root cellar, likely dug decades ago by whatever homesteader had originally tried to tame this barren patch of land before giving up. The cellar was small, maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, lined with crumbling brick. But it wasn't empty. Stacked floor to ceiling in the dry, protected darkness of the cellar was a massive cord of ancient, perfectly seasoned hickory and oak firewood. It had been sitting there untouched and protected from the moisture for years. It was bone dry. It was black gold. Evelyn let out a sob of absolute disbelief, pulling out a heavy gray log. It was incredibly dense, yet dry as a bone. This wood would burn hotter and longer than anything she could have scavenged. Marcus's act of sabotage, meant to freeze her to death, had literally forced her to unearth her salvation. But as she reached deeper into the cellar to grab more logs, her hand brushed against something metallic. She shifted a stack of the hickory wood aside, peering into the shadows at the very back of the earth-walled cellar. Sitting on a brick ledge hidden entirely from view was a heavy, rusted metal lockbox. Evelyn pulled it out into the fading light of the winter evening. It was heavy sealed, tight with a brass padlock. She looked at the lockbox, then back toward the road where Marcus had undoubtedly parked. A cold realization washed over her. Marcus hadn't bought this worthless piece of land purely to mock her. He had bought it at a tax auction, and Marcus Thorne never spent a dime unless he knew there was something valuable hidden beneath the surface. She gripped her utility knife, staring at the lock. She suddenly knew that surviving the winter was no longer her only problem. The cold does something peculiar to the human mind when it pushes past discomfort and enters the realm of lethal threat. It strips away all non-essential thoughts, reducing consciousness to a singular, glowing, imperative warmth. Evelyn knelt in the snow, her frozen fingers clutching the rusted metal lockbox. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her cheeks like a swarm of angry wasps. She stared at the padlock, her mind racing. The sheer weight of the box in her hands was a promise of something significant, but right now it was a piece of freezing metal pulling the heat from her palms. Survival had to come first. If she didn't get a fire started in the next 20 minutes, whatever secrets Marcus had buried would be discovered alongside her frozen corpse. She shoved the lockbox into her duffel bag just inside the entrance of the Quonset hut and turned back to the root cellar. The hickory wood was a miracle. It was decades old, seasoned to absolute perfection by the dry, dark conditions of the earthen tomb. She hauled 5 massive logs back to her ruined fire pit. The snow had melted into the depression, turning the ashes to freezing mud. She had to build a new hearth. Working with frantic energy, she gathered flat stones from the surrounding scrub, arranging them on a patch of frozen gravel just inside the overhang of her makeshift doorway. She took her utility knife and shaved away the dry bark of the hickory, creating a pile of paper-thin tinder. With her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold her plastic lighter, she struck the flint. Once. Twice. On the third try, a pathetic, wavering flame caught the edge of the bark. Because the wood had been protected from the humidity and snow, it caught fire with a fierce crackling eagerness that brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. Within minutes, the tinder ignited the smaller branches, which in turn caught the heavy, dense hickory logs. The heat that radiated from the fire was immediate and intense. Hickory burns hotter and longer than almost any other North American hardwood. It pushed back the encroaching darkness and bathed the interior of her mud and debris hut in a flickering golden glow. Evelyn collapsed in front of the flames, pulling her heavy jacket tight, feeling the agonizing, beautiful sensation of her blood beginning to thaw and circulate properly again. She arranged a ring of river stones around the blaze. These would be her thermal batteries for the night. As the fire roared, she finally allowed her attention to return to the heavy metal lockbox sitting in the shadows. She pulled it into the light of the fire. The padlock was thick industrial brass, but the hasp it clung to was rusted iron. Evelyn didn't have bolt cutters, but she had heat physics and a whole lot of anger. She took one of the large, smooth river stones she used for heating and placed it right on the edge of the fire until it was scorching hot. Using a piece of scrap PVC pipe to protect her hands, she rolled the hot stone out and laid the padlock directly against it, letting the brass heat up for 20 minutes. Then, grabbing the lockbox, she flipped it upside down and smashed the heated lock against a jagged edge of cold, exposed granite sticking out of the frozen ground. The extreme temperature shift from blazing hot to freezing cold brittled the metal. On the fourth desperate swinging strike, the rusted iron hasp shattered with a sharp crack. Evelyn fell back, breathing heavily. She sat up, pulled the box onto her lap, and slowly opened the lid. Inside, wrapped tightly in heavy-duty contractor bags to keep out the damp, were 3 distinct items. The first was a thick stack of $100 bills bundled with rubber bands. Evelyn thumbed through it, her heart hammering against her ribs. There had to be at least $50,000 in the stack. The second item was a small waterproof case containing 2 black USB flash drives. The third was a simple black leather-bound ledger. Evelyn opened the ledger. The pages were filled with Marcus's sharp, cramped handwriting. She recognized the names instantly. There were local building inspectors, a county zoning commissioner named Sterling, and the head of the regional union. Beside each name were dates, project codes, and massive dollar amounts. It was a masterclass in corruption. The ledger detailed years of kickbacks, inflated invoices, and embezzled funds from Marcus's own employees' pension accounts. But it was the back pages that made Evelyn's blood run cold. They detailed a complex web of shell companies and offshore transfers, preparing for a massive fraudulent bankruptcy filing that would wipe out his debts while leaving him secretly a millionaire. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Marcus hadn't deeded her this barren, worthless 2-acre plot as a cruel birthday joke. He had deeded it to her to distance his own name from his buried insurance policy. If the IRS or federal investigators came knocking this land, and the illegal fortune buried on it belonged on paper to his estranged wife. When Evelyn had confronted him a month ago about the odd receipts in his home office, he had panicked. He realized she was getting too close. He needed to get rid of her, but he also couldn't risk her talking to a lawyer, so he executed a sickeningly cruel plan. He threw her out onto the very land where his cash was hidden, knowing full well she had no resources. He assumed she would try to walk the 20 miles to town, get caught in the blizzard, and freeze to death. It would look like a tragic accident, an estranged, hysterical wife running out into a storm. And if she survived, he assumed she would flee the state in terror. Either way, his secret stash remained perfectly safe, buried in the middle of nowhere. But Marcus had miscalculated. He hadn't accounted for the Quonset hut. He hadn't accounted for the survival instinct of a woman pushed to the absolute edge. And in his arrogant attempt to finish the job by destroying her scavenged wood pile, he had unwittingly pointed her right to the trap door. Evelyn stared into the roaring hickory fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. She wasn't just a victim surviving the cold anymore. She was holding the detonator to Marcus Thorne's entire life. December descended upon the Bitterroot Valley like a physical weight. The snowpack reached 3 feet, turning the landscape into an alien, blindingly white ocean. Temperatures routinely plummeted to 10 degrees below zero. Yet beneath her mound of earth snow and scrap metal, Evelyn Vance was thriving. The discovery of the root cellar had completely altered the mathematics of her survival. The vast supply of dry hickory and oak meant she no longer had to burn precious calories scavenging for damp twigs. The fire burned consistently hot and smokeless. The heavy rocks she heated at night kept the interior of her $7 Quonset hut at a steady, comfortable 50 degrees, even when the wind chill outside was lethal. She used the heat to her advantage. She rigged a snow-melting station using a curved piece of scrap fiberglass, funneling fresh drinking water into a plastic jug. She used her utility knife to dig through the frozen topsoil in the cellar, discovering edible tubers and wild onions that the previous homesteader had planted decades ago. She roasted them in the hickory ashes, but the physical survival was secondary to the mental transformation. The cold and the isolation were forging her into something sharp and unbreakable. Every evening by the light of the fire, she studied the black ledger. She memorized the dates, the amounts, and the names of the corrupt officials Marcus had bought off. She understood the depth of the rot in her county. If she simply walked into the local sheriff's department with the box, there was a high probability the evidence would disappear, and she would be found dead in a ditch. Marcus had friends everywhere. She needed a fail-safe. She needed leverage outside the valley. In the second week of December, a brief sunny respite broke the relentless storms. The temperature crept up to a balmy 28 degrees. Evelyn knew this was her window. She dressed in layers, wrapping her boots in heavy duct tape to keep the moisture out. She took $500 from the lockbox, sliding it into her deepest pocket. She carefully tore 3 crucial pages from the back of the ledger, the ones detailing the offshore transfers and Commissioner Sterling's kickbacks. She folded them tightly and put them in a Ziploc bag she had scavenged from her original duffel. The 2-mile walk to Donovan's bait shop took her 2 hours, trudging through knee-deep drifts. When she finally pushed open the glass door, the bell jingled, sounding obnoxiously loud to ears accustomed only to the wind. Donovan dropped a box of fishing lures on the counter, his jaw falling open. Evelyn looked like a ghost from the frontier. Her face was tanned by the snow glare and wind smudged with wood ash. Her eyes, once soft and anxious, were hard, alert, and piercing. "Evelyn," Donovan breathed, rushing around the counter. "My God, girl! We thought—" "Marcus came in last week acting all sullen, saying you had run off to Seattle with a truck driver. Marcus is a liar," Evelyn said, her voice raspy from lack of use but steady as bedrock. "I'm still out on County Road 9. How in the hell are you surviving out there? There's no cabin." "I made do." She stepped closer to the counter. "Donovan, I need your help, but I need you to not ask questions. If you ask questions, you become a target." Donovan swallowed hard, looking at the grim determination etched into her features. He nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "I need your outgoing mail. I need a heavy envelope, a book of stamps, and a pen. And I need a cheap prepaid cell phone with a charger." Donovan moved quickly, grabbing the items from behind the counter. Evelyn laid 3 crisp $100 bills on the glass. "I can't take that, Evelyn," Donovan said, pushing the money back. "Take it," she insisted, sliding it forward. "It's not mine anyway. Consider it hazard pay." She took the pen and envelope to a small table in the corner. She addressed the envelope to the regional office of the FBI in Salt Lake City, far out of the jurisdiction of Marcus's local cronies. Inside, she placed the copied ledger pages and a brief unsigned note to be continued if Marcus Thorne's bankruptcy is approved. Check the accounts. She sealed it with heavy tape, plastered it with stamps, and handed it to Donovan. "This goes out with the postman tomorrow. You didn't see me drop it off." "Understood," Donovan said, looking at the letter like it was a live grenade. "One more thing," Evelyn said, turning back before she opened the door. "If Marcus comes around asking if you've seen me, tell him yes. Tell him I came in looking half dead, babbling about a hole in the ground. Donovan frowned, confused. Why would you want him to know that? Evelyn offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Because it's time for him to come visit his property. She stepped back out into the freezing glare of the snow, the prepaid phone safely tucked in her pocket, ready to spring the trap. Marcus Thorne was sweating despite the heavy cashmere coat he wore. He sat in his idling heated truck outside his lawyer's office in town, staring at the steering wheel. The bankruptcy proceedings were falling apart. The federal auditor had found a discrepancy in a shell company's tax filings and had ordered a freeze on all of Marcus's visible assets. He needed cash to pay off Commissioner Sterling, who was threatening to blow the whistle on the zoning frauds if he didn't get his cut by Christmas. Marcus's accounts were locked. His credit was frozen. The only money he had left in the world was sitting in a rusted lockbox buried in a root cellar on a frozen, barren plot of land 20 miles out of town. He hadn't been back to the property since the day he kicked Evelyn's woodpile apart. He had fully convinced himself she was dead. A heavy snowstorm had moved in the very next day. No one could survive that without shelter or fire. The coyotes had probably scattered her bones by now. It was a dark, ugly thought, but Marcus shoved it down into the moral void where he kept his conscience. He put the truck in gear and drove out toward County Road 9. The sky was the color of bruised iron, promising another heavy snowfall by nightfall. The wind was already picking up, causing the truck to sway slightly on the icy highway. When he reached the dirt turnoff, he engaged the four-wheel drive and plowed through the drifts, parking a half-mile from the property. He grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from the bed of his truck, just in case the ground above the cellar was frozen solid, and began the long hike over the ridge. As he crested the hill and looked down into the depression, he stopped dead in his tracks. He expected to see nothing but a smooth, white expanse of undisturbed snow. Instead, he saw the Quonset hut. It wasn't just standing, it had been fortified. The exterior was encased in a thick, solid shell of dirty ice, giving it the appearance of an impenetrable igloo. A steady, robust plume of smoke billowed from a cleverly engineered stone chimney sticking out of the side. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Marcus's chest. She's alive. He dropped to a crouch, his mind racing. If she was alive, she might have found the cellar. He gripped the crowbar tighter and moved cautiously down the slope, his boots crunching loudly in the crusty snow. He bypassed the hut, giving the entrance a wide berth, and headed straight for the rear of the property where the root cellar was hidden. As he approached, his worst fear was realized. The snow had been cleared away. The heavy wooden trap door was thrown wide open, resting against a snowbank. Marcus ran to the edge and looked down into the gloom. The massive pile of hickory wood had been significantly depleted. He ignored the wood and jumped down into the shallow cellar, scrambling to the back brick ledge. He shoved his hands into the shadows where he had left the lockbox. Nothing. He felt cold brick dirt and spider webs. The box was gone. Looking for this, Marcus whirled around, cracking his head painfully against the low wooden beam of the cellar roof. He staggered, looking up through the opening. Standing at the edge of the cellar, silhouetted against the gray, stormy sky, was Evelyn. She didn't look like the terrified, crying woman he had dragged out of his house 2 months ago. She was holding a heavy 4-foot length of galvanized steel pipe in one hand. In her other hand, she held the black leather ledger. Evelyn. Marcus breathed, shock temporarily overriding his anger. You're alive. No thanks to you, she said, her voice echoing down into the earthen hole. It was devoid of emotion, cold, factual. Listen to me, Marcus said, recovering his composure and trying to inject his usual commanding tone into his voice. He started to climb up the dirt steps out of the cellar. You don't know what you found. Give me the book in the box, Evelyn, now. Stay in the hole, Marcus, she commanded, raising the steel pipe. He paused 1 foot on the edge of the cellar, sizing her up. He outweighed her by 80 pounds. He had a crowbar. She was just a woman with a stick. He sneered. You think you can take me? You think a few weeks playing in the mud makes you tough? You're nothing without me. I've been nothing with you for 5 years, Evelyn replied evenly. I'm doing remarkably well out here. By the way, the Salt Lake City FBI field office says hello. Marcus froze, the color draining entirely from his face. What did you do? I mailed them 3 pages from this ledger yesterday. She lied, effortlessly exploiting the seed she had planted with Donovan. Just a taste, the offshore accounts, Commissioner Sterling's kickbacks. If I don't check in with a lawyer in Helena by Friday, the rest of the book goes in the mail. You're bluffing, Marcus spat, though his eyes darted nervously. Am I? Evelyn held up the ledger, flipping it open to show him the jagged edges where pages had been cleanly torn out. Marcus let out a roar of absolute unhinged fury. He lunged up from the cellar, swinging the heavy steel crowbar in a deadly arc toward her knees. But Evelyn had spent 2 months studying the terrain of her micro-kingdom. She knew every patch of ice, every hidden rock, every dip in the earth. She didn't retreat. As Marcus swung, she stepped nimbly to the left, directly onto a patch of packed-textured snow she used for traction. Marcus's boot hit the smooth, sloping sheet of glazed ice Evelyn had intentionally created by tossing her excess wastewater near the cellar edge. His feet flew out from under him. The momentum of his heavy swing spun him wildly out of control. He crashed down hard on his back, the breath exploding from his lungs in a violent whoosh. The crowbar clattered away over the ice. Before he could even gasp for air, Evelyn stepped forward. She brought the heavy steel pipe down, planting the end of it squarely and painfully onto the center of his chest, pinning him against the freezing ground. "Don't move," she said, leaning her body weight onto the pipe. Marcus gagged, staring up at her in terror. For the first time in his life, he realized he was looking down the barrel of someone else's absolute authority. "You left me out here to freeze to death," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You destroyed my wood. You tried to execute me, Marcus, and all you did was give me the keys to your destruction." "Evelyn, please." He wheezed, his bravado entirely vanished, replaced by the pathetic primal fear of a trapped animal. "I'll give you everything. I'll transfer the funds. I'll give you the house. Just don't turn me in." Evelyn looked down at the pathetic man pinned beneath her steel pipe. The wind howled around them, kicking up a swirl of fresh snow. "I already have everything," she said softly, "and you have nothing." She stepped back, lifting the pipe, and pulled the prepaid cell phone from her pocket. She dialed 911. "Yes, hello," Evelyn said calmly into the phone. Her eyes locked on Marcus as he scrambled weakly backward on the ice. "I need you to send the state police to the old Vance plot on County Road 9. Yes, state police, not the county sheriff. I have a man here attempting to assault me, and I have a ledger he's very desperate to keep hidden." Marcus scrambled to his feet, clutching his bruised chest, his eyes wide with panic. He looked at Evelyn standing resolute in front of her fortress of ice and steel, the roaring fire visible in the distance. He looked at the barren, frozen wasteland that was supposed to be her grave. With a pathetic sob of defeat, Marcus turned and began running, stumbling and falling through the deep snow back toward his truck, a desperate man fleeing from a ghost he had created. Evelyn stood still, watching him flounder in the snow. She lowered the phone, slipping it back into her pocket. She didn't chase him. She didn't need to. The state police would intercept him on the highway long before he reached the county line. She turned around, feeling the deep biting cold of the impending storm pressing against her jacket. But it didn't bother her anymore. The cold was no longer her enemy. It was her ally, her forge, her protector. She walked past the open root cellar, stepping inside the small, dark entrance of her Quonset hut. She dragged her heavy bag across the door, blocking out the wind. She sat down by the ring of hot stones, the dry hickory wood crackling and popping, casting a warm, golden, triumphant light over the woman who had built an empire for $7. The arrival of the authorities did not look like a rescue. It looked like a military operation. By midnight, County Road 9 was illuminated by the strobing red and blue lights of 4 Montana State Police cruisers and 2 unmarked black SUVs. The storm had fully unleashed its fury, dumping snow at a rate of 2 inches an hour. They had found Marcus Thorne, precisely where Evelyn knew they would, stuck in a snowdrift 3 miles down the highway, his truck's engine dead, the cabin rapidly freezing. He was shivering, bruised, and babbling incoherently about his wife, a steel pipe, and a stolen ledger. When the officers finally trudged up the ridge to Evelyn's property, Their heavy flashlights cut through the driving snow to reveal the bizarre ice-encrusted Quonset hut. Two officers, weapons drawn and shivering violently, approached the low entrance. Evelyn emerged, moving the heavy duffel bag aside. She did not raise her hands. She simply stood in the glow of the firelight, spilling from the entryway, looking at the heavily armed men with the calm detachment of a monarch receiving visitors at her border. "Evelyn Thorne!" a state trooper shouted over the wind, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Evelyn Vance," she corrected sharply. "My maiden name." An hour later, Evelyn sat in the back of one of the heated, unmarked SUVs. Sitting across from her was FBI Special Agent David Hollister, a man whose sharply tailored suit seemed entirely out of place in the brutal Montana wilderness. Hollister had driven out from the regional field office after intercepting the panic from the local sheriff's department, a department that Marcus had effectively kept on his payroll. "Mrs. Vance." Hollister began holding up the black leather ledger in a clear evidence bag. "Your husband is claiming you stole this from his home office and lured him out here to extort him." Evelyn let out a dry, humorless laugh. She looked down at her hands, calloused, scarred, and permanently ingrained with wood ash and dirt. Then she looked at Hollister. "Agent Hollister, do I look like a mastermind extortionist?" "Look at that hut. Look at the ice. Look at the root cellar where he buried his insurance policy. I didn't lure him. I survived him." She reached into her heavy utility jacket and pulled out the small waterproof case containing the two black USB flash drives. She placed it on the console between them. "The ledger gives you the numbers," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "The flash drives give you the routing numbers for his offshore shell companies, the banking passwords. And if Marcus is as paranoid as I know, he has probably audio recordings of his meetings with Commissioner Sterling. He always recorded his contractors to hold it over them." Hollister stared at the drives, then back at Evelyn. The respect in his eyes was immediate and palpable. "Why give this to me now? Why not leverage it further?" "Because the cold is enough of an enemy," Evelyn replied, pulling her coat tighter. "I don't need the federal government or Marcus's corrupt friends coming after me. You take the evidence. You take Marcus. You freeze his assets. You leave me alone." Hollister nodded slowly. "What about the cash?" Thorne was screaming something about a lockbox full of cash. Evelyn didn't blink. Her heart rate didn't elevate. She had anticipated this. Before the police arrived, she had taken the $50,000, wrapped it in 3 layers of heavy plastic, and buried it deep beneath the ash pile of her fire pit, covering it with boiling hot coals. "Marcus is a desperate, bankrupt man who just tried to murder his wife with a crowbar," Evelyn said coldly. "If there was cash, do you think he would have left it here in the dirt while his business failed? He was looking for his ledger. That's all there was." Hollister studied her face for a long, piercing moment. He knew she was lying, and she knew that he knew. But looking out the window at the bleak, frozen wasteland and looking back at the woman who had conquered it with nothing but trash and willpower, he made a choice. He zipped his briefcase shut. "We'll need a formal statement in the morning," Hollister said. "We can take you to a hotel in town, a hospital." "No," Evelyn said, opening the door of the SUV, letting the howling wind bite into the heated cabin. "I'm going home." She stepped out into the blizzard and walked back to her $7 Quonset hut. The true test, however, was not the police. It was January. Locals in the Bitterroot Valley call it the Siberian Express, a brutal, stagnant high-pressure system that drops down from the Arctic, plunging temperatures to 30 degrees below zero and holding them there for weeks. The snow stopped falling, replaced by a sky so clear and blue it hurt the eyes, and a cold so absolute it felt like physical pressure against the skin. The moisture inside the Quonset hut, generated by Evelyn's breath and the melting snow for her drinking water, began to freeze on the interior walls. The thick layer of earth and debris on the roof, heavily saturated with frozen snow, became terrifyingly heavy. One night, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the hut, jolting Evelyn awake. She scrambled to her feet, shining her flashlight up at the ceiling. The heavy-duty PVC pipe she'd used as a spine for the cattle panels had snapped under the sheer crushing weight of the ice. The ceiling was visibly bowing inward. If the roof collapsed, she would be buried alive under a ton of frozen mud and steel mesh. Panic threatened to choke her, but the discipline she had forged over the past months kicked in. She had to shore up the structure, and she had to do it immediately. She ran out to the root cellar, fighting through the waist-deep snow, and dragged back the thickest, heaviest logs of hickory she had left. She couldn't burn them. They had to become pillars. She placed flat stones on the dirt floor to act as footings, wedged the heavy hickory logs vertically under the sagging steel panels, and used a massive river rock as a hammer to drive them tight against the ceiling. She spent 3 agonizing, sleepless nights rotating the pillars, adjusting the tension, and praying the zip ties wouldn't shatter in the sub-zero temperatures. She used the $50,000 she had hidden not as money, but as psychological fuel. Every time she felt her muscles giving out, every time the biting cold told her to just lie down and sleep, she thought of the cash beneath the ashes. It wasn't just paper. It was her future. It was the farm she would build, the life she would reclaim. She refused to die in a mud hole when freedom was buried 6 inches below her feet. The hut held. The steel groaned, the ice cracked, but the $7 shelter refused to cave. Evelyn had built it with the desperate strength of a survivor, and it reflected her unbreakable will. By the time February bled into March, the Siberian Express finally broke, and the long dark began to lift. By late April, the snow began to retreat, leaving behind a landscape of treacherous, sucking mud. The Bitterroot Valley exploded into sudden violent color as the wildflowers reclaimed the scrubland. Evelyn's Quonset hut, stripped of its pristine white armor, looked like a bizarre, muddy barrow from a forgotten age. But to Evelyn, it was a palace. The spring brought warmth, but it also brought a subpoena. Marcus Thorne's federal trial was set to begin in Helena. He had pleaded not guilty to all charges: embezzlement wire, fraud, bribery, and the attempted murder of his wife. He had hired Harrison Gable, a notoriously aggressive defense attorney from Seattle, known for destroying the credibility of witnesses. Evelyn drove to the courthouse in a used, reliable Subaru she had purchased with a small, untraceable portion of the lockbox cash. She walked into the marble-floored building wearing a simple, sharp gray suit. Her skin was still deeply tanned from the winter glare, and she carried a quiet, terrifying stillness that made people instinctively step out of her way in the hallways. When she took the witness stand, the courtroom fell utterly silent. Harrison Gable approached her like a shark circling a wounded seal. He smiled, adjusting his silk tie. "Mrs. Thorne." Gable began intentionally using the married name she despised. "You expect this jury to believe a rather fantastical tale. You claim my client, a respected local businessman, abandoned you in the wilderness to die. Yet here you are looking remarkably healthy. In fact, you survived a winter that killed seasoned livestock. Isn't it true, Mrs. Thorne, that you are an experienced survivalist, that you planned this entire theatrical stunt to frame my client and steal his assets?" Evelyn looked at Gable. She didn't look angry. She looked profoundly bored. "I was a receptionist at a medical clinic, Mr. Gable," Evelyn said, her voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. "The most outdoorsy thing I did before October was water my hydrangeas." Gable scoffed. "Then how do you explain your miraculous survival? How did you build a shelter out of thin air?" "Not thin air," Evelyn corrected. "I built it out of trash. Discarded cattle panels, old PVC pipe zip ties, and a plastic tarp. It cost me exactly $7. I survived because the alternative was dying, and I decided Marcus wasn't worth dying for." "Fascinating," Gable said mockingly. "And this ledger you claim to have found, you say it was buried in a root cellar. Isn't it far more likely that you buried it there, that you compiled these forged documents over the years, embezzled the money yourself, and are now using this elaborate survival story as a smokescreen?" "Objection," the federal prosecutor interjected. "Argumentative." "I'll allow it," the judge said, leaning forward, clearly captivated by the witness. "You may answer, Ms. Vance." Evelyn leaned into the microphone. "Mr. Gable, if I had embezzled millions of dollars, do you really think I would choose to spend December eating wild onions I dug out of frozen mud with a plastic knife?" Do you think I would spend my nights rotating hot rocks just to keep my toes from turning black with frostbite? A low murmur rippled through the jury box. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, her gaze shifting to Marcus, who was sitting pale and sweating at the defense table. I didn't forge the ledger, but more importantly, I couldn't have forged the audio. Gable frowned, caught off guard. Audio. The prosecutor stood up. Your Honor, the defense is well aware of Exhibit C, the contents of the flash drives Ms. Vance recovered. Evelyn smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. Marcus always thought he was the smartest man in the room. He recorded Commissioner Sterling demanding a $50,000 kickback on the Riverside development. He kept it as blackmail. The audio is on the drive. It's his voice, his office, his corruption. Gable deflated visibly. He had hoped to attack her character to make her look like a hysterical, vengeful ex-wife. But Evelyn was a wall of stone. She answered every question with brutal, unvarnished truth about the cold, the starvation, and the sheer cruelty of what Marcus had done. When the prosecutor played the audio recordings from the flash drives, Marcus buried his face in his hands. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Marcus Thorne was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Commissioner Sterling and 3 other county officials were indicted the following week. As Evelyn walked out of the courthouse and into the bright May sunshine, Agent Hollister was waiting by her car. You did good in there, Hollister said, leaning against the Subaru. You dismantled him. He dismantled himself, Evelyn said, unlocking her door. I just handed you the instructions. Hollister paused, looking her in the eye. You know, the IRS offers a whistleblower informant award, up to 30% of recovered assets in massive tax fraud cases. Given the millions Thorne was hiding in those offshore accounts, you're looking at a very substantial legal payout, completely legitimate, tax-free. Evelyn paused. She thought of the $50,000 buried in the mud back at the hut. It was a fortune to her a few months ago. Now it was just the seed money. Keep the paperwork ready, Agent Hollister, Evelyn said. I have a farm to build. 2 years later, County Road 9 was unrecognizable. The barren, rocky 2-acre plot that Marcus Thorne had mockingly deeded to Evelyn had expanded. Using her massive, entirely legal IRS whistleblower reward, Evelyn had purchased the adjoining 40 acres of land. The heavy, groaning diesel machinery of contractors she vetted ruthlessly and paid generously, had transformed the landscape. A deep-water well had been drilled, bringing up crystal-clear freezing water from the valley aquifer. A massive array of solar panels sat on the southern ridge, soaking up the fierce Montana sun. At the center of the property stood a beautiful, modern, timber frame house. It was built with soaring windows that looked out over the Bitterroot Mountains, thick insulation, and a massive stone hearth in the center of the living room that burned split hickory all winter long. But Evelyn rarely spent her days in the big house. A few hundred yards away, sitting exactly where it had been built on that freezing October evening, was the Quonset hut. Evelyn hadn't torn it down. Instead, she had excavated the dirt and debris from the outside, revealing the rusted steel cattle panels and the heavy black zip ties. She had poured a concrete foundation around the perimeter to stabilize it and encased the entire arched structure in heavy, double-paned greenhouse glass. The $7 survival shelter was now the centerpiece of the Vance sanctuary. Evelyn had turned the property into a working off-grid educational farm and retreat center specifically designed for women who had escaped domestic violence and severe financial abuse. She taught them how to use power tools, how to manage solar arrays, how to grow their own food, and most importantly, how to manage their own finances without relying on a partner. On a crisp October afternoon, exactly 2 years to the day after Marcus had thrown her out of his truck, Evelyn was standing inside the glass-encased Quonset hut. It was currently filled with rows of flourishing heirloom tomatoes and vibrant winter greens kept warm by the sun and the residual heat of the earth. A group of 6 women, all bearing the invisible heavy scars of their past lives, were gathered around her. They were learning how to splice irrigation lines. The trick is not to force the fitting, Evelyn explained, demonstrating with a piece of PVC pipe, the exact same type of pipe she had once used to hold her frozen ceiling together. You apply steady pressure, you adapt to the material. If you force it, it shatters. If you guide it, it holds forever. A woman named Sarah, who had arrived at the sanctuary 3 weeks prior with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a black eye, looked around the beautiful, warm greenhouse. "Evelyn," Sarah asked softly, "is it true what they say in town, that you built this whole place from nothing, that you survived out here in the dirt?" Evelyn looked down at her hands. The deep calluses from hauling firewood were still there. They would never fully go away. She looked at the rusted steel mesh of the cattle panel curving above their heads, forever encased in glass. "I didn't build it from nothing," Evelyn said, a genuine warm smile touching her eyes. "I built it with $7, a lot of spite, and a refusal to let someone else dictate my worth." She set the pipe down and looked at the women, her gaze fierce and protective. "The world will try to tell you that you are helpless without the safety nets they provide. They will try to freeze you out. But let me tell you a secret about the cold." Evelyn walked over to the old stone fire pit which she had preserved in the center of the greenhouse floor. "The cold doesn't destroy you," Evelyn said quietly, the echoes of the howling blizzard long replaced by the gentle hum of greenhouse fans. "The cold just burns away everything you don't need, and what's left behind is unbreakable. The human spirit is not a fragile thing. It is a forge." Evelyn Vance's journey from a terrified, evicted wife with $7 to the architect of her own sanctuary proves that our darkest, coldest moments often revealed the strength we never knew we possessed. She didn't just survive the winter, she used it to build an empire. If you found yourself captivated by Evelyn's resilience, her cunning, and her ultimate triumph over those who sought to destroy her, please like this video. Share it with anyone who needs a reminder of their own inner power, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of survival justice and the unbreakable human will. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were stranded with only $7? Until next time, stay strong and keep building your own fortress.